In June of 2013, my husband Michael and I had envisioned a serene week at our old family farmhouse in rural Maine. It was meant to be the ideal escape, a moment for our family to rejuvenate away from the hustle and bustle of the city. However, Michael, serving the U.S. Army, was unable to secure leave at the last moment. Rather than abandon our plans, I chose to proceed with our two children, Emily, who was 10, and Jacob, who was 8. The farmhouse, nestled a few miles outside of Ellsworth, is enveloped by acres of wild fields, a rustic structure built in the late 1940s. My grandfather's place has always offered a sense of solace, with its creaky porch and the aroma of aged wood. At times, it can feel quite remote. The cell reception is unreliable, and the security is just basic locks on the doors and windows. We arrived on a bright afternoon, and the kids eagerly raced around, thrilled to explore the orchard and the little flower garden in the back. Everything felt just right that first day. I unpacked the groceries, checked the plumbing, and experienced a gentle wave of relief, even in Michael's absence. I felt content to share this corner of my childhood with Emily and Jacob. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. I noticed something odd. The old deck chair near the railing wasn't where it had been. It looked like it had been pulled halfway across the porch. My first thought was that the kids had moved it, but when I asked them, they both insisted they hadn't touched it. Later that day, I also realized a small garden statue, a weathered gnome, had shifted several inches from its usual spot. Little details, but enough to make me uneasy. With no cameras or alarms in sight, my options were limited. I meticulously checked the locks and resolved to stay vigilant. I attempted to mask my unease, yet my thoughts kept returning to the peculiar act of shifting a deck chair or a garden statue. Such a triviality. That afternoon, Emily and Jacob were playing tag near the bushes bordering the backyard fence. While I was inside washing dishes, I suddenly heard Jacob's yell. I dashed outside, bracing for a scraped knee or a bee sting, but instead found both kids looking visibly shaken. Jacob leaned in and murmured about a figure in a white mask lurking behind the foliage. Emily acknowledged his words, noting how the man had crouched low upon being seen. I rushed to the fence, but the area was empty. I made an effort to remain composed. There were a few neighbors along the nearby road. Perhaps one had wandered onto our property for some strange reason. I informed the kids that we would remain indoors for the remainder of the day, just to be cautious. Night fell without any further events. We secured the doors and settled in the living room, the three of us nestled together. The pull-out sofa, with every creak echoing through the house, had my nerves frayed. Yet, aside from my own restless thoughts, nothing else transpired. The next morning, I spotted footprints in the soft dirt beside the farmhouse. It appeared someone had circled the entire building, and my heart raced with the unsettling realization that this was no mere figment of my imagination. Someone had clearly been wandering the property overnight. The rest of the day was spent in a state of heightened alertness, every rustle igniting my suspicion. That evening, after tucking Emily and Jacob into bed, I gazed out the window toward the garden. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a tall figure standing near the gnome statue, partially obscured by the shrubs. The figure remained still, as if examining the house. I froze, unsure of what to do next. Then, he turned his head in my direction. Even from afar, I felt the weight of his gaze. It was fleeting. The moment he spotted me, he bolted, racing across the yard and vanishing into the same line of bushes where the kids had seen him. Early the next morning, I reached out to the local police department. An officer named Benson arrived within the hour. He searched the property, looking for footprints or signs of forced entry, but found nothing definitive. It was both frustrating and somewhat embarrassing to explain, as aside from some moved objects and footprints, we lacked concrete evidence to identify the culprit. The remainder of our stay unfolded uneventfully. Whoever that masked figure was, he never returned. Perhaps our call had deterred him. After the encounter with the police, he felt a sense of unease. Emily and Jacob shared that tension, but as time passed, We made an effort to concentrate on the brighter sides of our trip. Yet, I found it hard to let my guard down. Each night, I would sit by the window, watching the yard for any signs of life. When our vacation came to an end, we drove back, feeling a sense of relief at returning to the hustle and bustle of familiar streets and neighbors. I confided in Michael about everything, but without any evidence. There was little we could do except move forward. Sometimes, I still ponder who that man was and what his intentions were as he lurked around. Our farmhouse, nestled in the middle of nowhere, stirs a part of me that worries he might have done the same to others' homes. Perhaps just observing, perhaps plotting something more sinister. I was 19 then, working the late shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of Redfield, about 30 minutes from my home. My schedule typically ran from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. Most nights, I found myself sipping cold coffee, fighting off sleep at the register, and wishing for a calm shift without any surprises. When I first started, the area was pretty quiet, and I convinced myself it would be a straightforward job, just ringing up drinks and snacks, maybe assisting someone with gas if they looked lost. Easy money, I thought. I still recall the first time I encountered the old man. It was a Tuesday night in early November, just another typical shift, nothing unusual. He walked in around 2 a.m., dressed in a neatly pressed flannel, with a clean shirt, jeans, and a small newspaper tucked under his arm. His voice cracked softly as he mumbled a good evening. There was something disarming about him. Perhaps it was the friendly, grandfatherly aura he exuded. He brought a black coffee, thanked me with a warm smile, and headed out. It seemed like no big deal at first, but he began returning night after night, usually around the same time. Eventually, I found myself preparing his coffee before he even had to ask. To be honest, I looked forward to seeing him. Working that shift felt lonely, and his presence brightened it. Longed for connection, seeking any form of dialogue to fill the time. He introduced himself as Martin, omitting a last name, and I didn't inquire further. It was refreshing to share a bit of camaraderie. Over the next week, our conversations deepened, remaining casual. We discussed local news, the weather, and the approaching holidays. Occasionally, he would inquire about the station, how many employees were there, whether we had cameras inside, and if we kept a significant amount of cash in the register at night. Initially, I brushed it off. After all, people often have their curiosities. It was intriguing, particularly among the older crowd, and I had heard that lonely retirees often linger at gas stations or small diners just for a chat. Yet, I couldn't shake the oddity of how he persistently redirected our conversation to store procedures on November 10th at around 3 a.m. He arrived with his familiar smile, coffee in hand, casually leaning against the counter. He inquired if I felt secure working by myself. I shrugged it off, assuring him that I did. We have a solid security system, and we never keep more than a few hundred in the register at once. I even shared details about 755. Our manager, Don, would occasionally make unexpected visits. Martin listened intently, tilting his head and giving a thoughtful nod before shifting the conversation. A few nights later, a couple of local officers entered. I didn't recognize them, but they appeared tense. When asked if I had noticed any suspicious activity in the area, I hesitated for a moment, recalling Martin's strangely detailed inquiries. But I assured the officers I hadn't seen anything unusual, just the usual regulars and familiar night owls. They departed quickly, without further discussion. After making a purchase, an odd sensation settled in my stomach, but I reassured myself that I was merely overreacting. Martin continued to drop by, and our conversations flowed. By mid-November, I had inadvertently revealed numerous details: how the security cameras occasionally malfunctioned, how I was the sole key holder for the supply room at night, and even my usual routine for counting the drawer. It may sound foolish now, but at the time, I was simply thrilled to have someone to talk to. He never came across as threatening or insistent. He merely nodded and posed casual follow-up questions, as if he were genuinely interested. On November 19th, I recall a peculiar tension hanging in the air. The parking lot was eerily silent, and the overhead lights appeared dimmer than normal. Martin was late, which stirred a sense of unease within me. I attempted to dismiss it, yet that unsettling stillness persisted as the clock struck 4 a.m. No customers had entered for nearly 2 hours, which was unusual even for our slow days. I stepped away from the counter to restock some sodas when I heard it, a loud crash from the back of the store. My heart raced, and I half expected Martin to jump out from behind something. The shelves loomed ominously, casting shadows that danced in the dim light. The door stood ajar, and a few boxes lay scattered on the floor. Initially, I dismissed it as a mere mishap, but then I caught sight of two figures, their faces obscured by ski masks, darting through the storage area. One clutched a duffel bag, while the other brandished what appeared to be a pistol. They were oblivious to my presence, so I crouched behind the aisle, straining to keep my breath steady. My thoughts raced. Where was Martin? Was he here as well? After what felt like an eternity, I heard their hurried footsteps retreating through the back door. I remained frozen, my heart pounding, until silence enveloped the space once more. Footsteps anymore, I rushed to the front to call the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever was involved had vanished. The entire back storeroom was in disarray. The register had been pried open, cash was missing, and a security camera lay shattered. The police interrogated me for hours, but all I could think about was Martin. Did he have a hand in this? As it turned out, the break-in was part of a series of robberies in nearby counties. The next day, the cops brought me in for more questioning because of my connection to Martin. They showed me grainy footage from a gas station security camera revealed him, clad in the same flannel. Yet his expression was starkly different, focused, steely-eyed, devoid of the warm smile I once remembered. My stomach sank as they probed me with questions about his appearance, our conversation, and the details I had shared. A wave of nausea washed over me as I recognized the meticulous way he had manipulated me, exploiting my loneliness, boredom, and kindness to extract every necessary detail for a swift and clean robbery. I loathed myself for my blindness to it all. A week slipped by, and restful sleep had eluded me since that moment. One afternoon, my manager called to inform me that Martin had been arrested and was in custody. It turned out his real name wasn't Martin at all. The police discovered him barricaded in his basement, where he had been hiding after the robbery, likely waiting for the heat to die down. They found a significant amount of stolen merchandise, money, and a stash of peculiar documentation about local stores, including my gas station. I felt a brief sense of relief, but then my manager mentioned something unsettling. When the cops searched his basement, they found a list of employees, details about our schedules, and even personal notes next to my name included a phone number that wasn't mine. We still don't know whose number it was, and that's the part one can't let go of before we dive into the next story. If you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. Your support means the world to us, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks! I was a junior at Greenfield College in October 2019, my days in upstate New York unfolded in a familiar pattern. I would rise around 7 a.m., attend my first lecture at 8 o'clock, and share lunch with friends around noon. Evenings were often spent in study sessions or at the library. My dorm, located on the second floor of Maple Hall, the all-girls residence, was a cozy space characterized by a narrow hallway, identical wooden doors, and the usual chatter from neighbors. One Monday afternoon, my friend Kristen remarked that she had observed a tall man in a black hoodie lingered near the student center. At first, I dismissed it with a laugh, having never noticed anyone unusual before. Kristen shrugged it off, suggesting he might just be a student with a class nearby. It didn't seem significant until others subtly mentioned they had also seen someone dressed the same way, always near me, but never approaching. As the week progressed, I became increasingly aware of my surroundings every time I crossed that path. As I walked through campus, my eyes would scan the surroundings, hoping to spot that familiar hoodie. There were fleeting moments when I thought I caught a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye, but each time I tried to focus, they vanished into the crowd or turned out to be a stranger. When I shared this with my roommate, Mary, she insisted I was letting my imagination run wild. I almost believed her, especially since I hadn't actually seen any man in a hoodie deliberately following me. That Thursday, after my evening lab, I left the building around 9, and the path to Maple Hall was shrouded in dim light. As I made my way back, I noticed someone in a hoodie approaching from the far side of the quad. My heart raced, but as he walked by, he didn't even look my way. A blend of relief and frustration washed over me. Could this be the same person everyone had been talking about? It was just a fleeting encounter, leaving me no closer to an answer. On Friday night, Mary and I chose to spend some extra time in the campus library. Midterm papers were looming, and the quiet atmosphere helped me focus. Around 10:30, Mary mentioned she was tired and wanted to leave. Returning to the dorm, I felt compelled to linger a bit longer in search of an important reference book she had left behind. The second floor was nearly empty as I scanned the shelves beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Leaning forward, I was grappling with a worn copy of an old literary commentary when a low voice broke the silence, asking if this was the book I was looking for. Startled, I turned to find the same figure in a black hoodie, the hood pulled halfway over his face. He handed me the exact volume I had been seeking. I expressed my gratitude quietly, uncertain of what else to say, to speak, and swiftly made my way out of the aisle. By the time I reached the library exit, I found myself questioning whether I should have inquired about his frequent presence or even asked for his name. Yet, an unsettling feeling washed over me, and all I desired was to retreat to my room. Outside, the campus felt unusually desolate. Street lamps cast faint circles of light along the walkway. Halfway to Maple Hall, I heard footsteps behind me, which ceased when I halted. When I turned around, there was no one in sight, but I thought I glimpsed a flicker of movement near a large oak tree. My heart raced and I broke into a brisk walk, my footsteps quickening. I glanced back, and there he was, the same figure in that dark hoodie, standing still, gripping something behind his back as if concealing it. Without a second thought, I sprinted toward my dorm, my heart pounding in rhythm with my hurried steps. I could hear his feet slapping against the concrete behind me. The path felt endless. But finally, Maple Hall came into view. I burst through the main door, nearly knocking it off its hinges, and raced upstairs to my room. Once inside, after locking the door, I stood there, attempting to steady my breath. I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, but they never paused at my door, and eventually, the night fell into silence. Early the next morning, I reported the incident to campus security. An officer named Mr. Thompson took my statement in his small, cluttered office near the administration building. He appeared to take it seriously, inquiring about the man's description and behavior. For the rest of the day, I made sure to avoid being alone, staying close to Kristen and Mary. Every random passerby in a hoodie made me flinch. Over the following weeks, there were no more sightings of the strange man. No one else reported a student or visitor matching his description. The campus felt oddly the same, and yet for me, it was changed forever. Security never identified him, nor did he make another appearance. It's been years since then, but the memory still lingers. No one could ever tell me if he was a harmless loner who happened to be around too often or something far worse. I create, and for a long time, my primary source of income came from attending comic, anime, and video game conventions across the US and Canada, and occasionally in other countries. You might be surprised by how lucrative it can be if you strategize effectively. However, it involves much more effort than many realize. Countless hours spent at a table engaging with interested attendees and ensuring fresh inventory at every location. In those days, I would create custom drawings for people right at the conventions. But as my skills evolved and my schedule became more demanding, I ultimately chose to stop. It simply no longer aligned with my schedule, and I was transitioning to larger projects while wrapping up my commission work. At a convention, a man approached me and inquired if I could create something furry-related for him. Initially, I hesitated as I had never ventured into furry artwork before. However, the offer was tempting, and the compensation was substantial. Though it felt a bit uncomfortable, I decided to give it a try. One evening, after completing that piece, I noticed that word had circulated within the community about my abilities, leading to an influx of requests. Individuals who appreciated my aesthetic and sought out similar illustrations featuring anthropomorphic characters with vibrant and whimsical designs inspired me. It didn't take long for me to conceive the idea of establishing a distinct account on a furry-centric art platform, adopting a new alias to maintain my personal identity's privacy. I believed this separation would not disrupt my usual comic work. As time passed, I connected with numerous people online. Most were friendly, some were quite quirky, and a handful had truly original requests. Eventually, I started conversing with another furry artist, and she and we connected through laughter about our shared experiences, forming a relaxed friendship. She mentioned that while she wasn't particularly invested in the scene, she was attracted to it for the creativity and the sense of community. I resonated with that sentiment. I valued the audience, but never fully immersed myself in the lifestyle. A few months later, she proposed that I attend a furry convention, or at the very least, a hybrid event that merged an anime con I was already planning to go to with a furry con taking place at the same venue that weekend. It seemed like an intriguing opportunity to explore something new. Attendees, and she had kindly offered to share her dealer's table with me for a day. We also coordinated to share a hotel room, which is a common practice among those in the community looking to save on expenses. I arrived on a Thursday prepared for my anime con, but her furry con had already kicked off. She messaged me to stop by her table in the dealer's den, and since I had no plans for that evening, I figured it would be a good idea. I picked up a temporary badge she had arranged for me and made my way inside. The first thing that caught my eye was the diverse selection of vibrant fruits, dancing lights, and a crowd buzzing with an energy distinct from the anime conventions I was familiar with. At her table stood a figure clad in an elaborate fur suit, a bright pink, cartoonish wolf with large, expressive eyes. I presumed it was my friend, even though I had never witnessed her in costume before. I attempted to introduce myself, but she remained silent, nodding and emitting a soft squeak from a hidden toy in her paw. She communicated through gestures, clearly preferring to stay in character rather than speak. This caught me off guard, as during the online chats, she displayed a sarcastic and talkative demeanor, which I dismissed, thinking it might just be her way of navigating conventions. We spent a few hours at her table, and I tried my best to engage with those walking by, selling some small prints. As the evening progressed, it was around 7 p.m. We packed up, and she remained in full costume the whole time, pantomiming and squeaking, not saying a single word. Once we arrived at our shared hotel room, I collapsed on my bed. That's when the atmosphere shifted. She approached me and, without any warning, reached out and tickled my exposed side. I instinctively jolted away, my heart pounding from the surprise. Her character movements didn't change. She continued with these silent, cutesy gestures, but made me uneasy. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but her behavior felt odd. She made a motion like I was going to shower, grabbed some things, and vanished into the bathroom. That's when I decided I needed some fresh air. The idea of waiting around alone for someone I couldn't even see was unsettling. The conversation left me feeling unsettled. I noticed her wallet was on the table, and I recalled seeing her slip a hotel key into it. I quickly opened it, thinking I could grab the key and step out for a moment, planning to return later with a friend. However, as soon as I opened the wallet, I saw an ID in the clear slot. It belonged to someone entirely different from the image I had in my mind. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, thinning hair, and a grim expression. This was not the same young woman I had befriended online. My stomach dropped, and all I could think about was how I just spent hours alone at a table with someone I knew nothing about in real life. Who were they? What did they want? My mind raced into survival mode. I grabbed the hotel key, tossed the wallet onto the table, and bolted out the door. I dashed down the stairwell, my heart pounding with each step until I reached the lobby. Once there, I called a friend of mine, a big tough guy also in town for the anime con. He agreed to help me retrieve my belongings. When he returned, he said the room was empty, no sign of the fruit. No, with no luggage in sight. It felt as if that person had simply disappeared. Shaken, I stumbled into my friend's hotel room for the rest of the convention, steering clear of the dealer's den and severing every online link I had with that friend. The entire ordeal unsettled me to the point of abandoning my furry alias altogether. Whatever ventures I was pursuing there weren't worth the chance of encountering someone who was not who they appear to be. I lost my wife in January 2016. Her name was Allison, and she tragically passed away on a two-lane highway just outside. In Redwood Falls, Minnesota, the police informed me that a long-haul truck driver had dozed off at the wheel, veering over the line and colliding with her car. She had no chance. He is now serving time, yet that knowledge never offered me solace. For weeks, I hardly stepped outside our home on Oak Street. The reminders of her absence were too much to bear. The half-empty closet, her favorite coffee mug by the sink, the little notes she used to tuck into my lunch. Evenings became a particular kind of torment as I sat in my recliner, staring blankly at the TV. Yet, I seldom engaged with anything on the screen. Instead, I found myself fixated on the emptiness before me, contemplating the fragility of life. One Saturday night in mid-February, the pang of longing for Allison became unbearable around 10:30 p.m. I picked up my jacket and keys, making the choice to go to her grave. It wasn't the wisest decision. I felt weary, the roads were still, in a cemetery. It was almost 11 p.m. when the event unfolded. Isn't exactly reassuring, yet I couldn't dismiss the longing to be near her, even in such a bleak setting. I drove west on County Road 14, the one that meanders through fields and old industrial sites. It took a bit longer than the highway, but there was less traffic at that hour, even though it felt utterly deserted. My headlights revealed nothing but an unending stretch of asphalt and the occasional outline of a barn or silo in the distance. Halfway along the route, I noticed a car parked at an odd angle on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. In the dim glow, I noticed a woman standing beside her car. As I slowed down, my heart skipped a beat. She resembled Jason, same height, same brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. It felt surreal, and perhaps that's why I didn't hesitate to pull over. I rolled down my window, and she stepped closer. Mentioning her car wouldn't start. Her voice was soft, trembling just enough to evoke my sympathy. I offered to take a look, casually mentioning that I worked as a mechanic at a local shop called Don's Auto Service. She appeared relieved as she guided me to the front of the car, lifting the hood. I conducted a swift inspection of the battery cables, belts, and hoses. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet, my mind was racing. Why did she resemble Allison so closely? It was baffling, but grief can warp perception in unexpected ways. I attempted to concentrate, but an unsettling feeling took root in my stomach. Suddenly, I heard a shuffle behind me. Before I could react, something struck me on the back of the head. The world tilted, and my knees gave way, sending me crashing onto the pavement, my vision blurring. In a fleeting moment, I caught sight of two figures stepping out from the shadows. One gripped a steel rod tightly. The woman stood there, her gaze icy, as if she had ensnared me in a carefully laid trap. Then, everything faded to black. When consciousness returned, I found myself in a hospital bed, the fluorescent lights glaring down and a dull throb pulsing at the back of my head. A doctor named Morgan informed me that he had been en route to Redwood Falls Hospital for his night shift when he discovered me lying alone by the roadside, with no other vehicle, no woman, and no one else in sight, just me, unconscious, in a state of distress. I inquired about my car, only to be met with the grim response that no vehicle had been seen on the shoulder, just my body lying on the pavement. Panic enveloped me as I contacted the police to report the attack and the disappearance of my car. Days morphed into weeks, yet no updates materialized. Each phone call concluded with the same disheartening refrain. "We're looking into it, sir." There was no security footage, no eyewitnesses, and no sign of my vehicle's license plate in the area. Friends and family attempted to comfort me, suggesting it might have been a random carjacking, while others insinuated that perhaps I had been imagining the entire ordeal. Details of my sorrow may have twisted what I experienced. Yet, I'm certain of what I saw. I can vividly recall how that woman's hair and face mirrored Allison's. Her voice lingers in my mind, guiding me into that fragile moment. I still find myself visiting Allison's grave, though not after dark. Occasionally, I leave flowers and reflect on the events that unfolded on that road. I ponder the identities of those men, whether the woman was complicit from the beginning and why they abandoned me in such a dire state. A part of me cannot shake the feeling that they had something far more sinister in mind than merely taking a car. You understand how life can get so hectic that you lose sight of the one you cherish. That was the case for Ben and me back in 2018. We both had demanding careers. I'm a nurse, and he's in software development. For months, we hadn't managed to carve out any real time for each other. Our schedules rarely aligned, and when they did, we were often too drained to enjoy ourselves. Frustrations began to rise, and minor disagreements surfaced over trivial matters. Eventually, we recognized the need for a break. We made the decision to rent an Airbnb for an entire week in 2018, just the two of us hoping for a reset. We could unwind and rekindle our connection as we discovered a charming house nestled in a quaint town just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The listing highlighted a serene setting, a spacious backyard, and easy access to hiking trails, precisely what we were seeking. The host appeared amicable in his online correspondence, casually mentioning a thumping noise occasionally emanating from the basement pipes, but reassuring us it was nothing to fret over. It seemed like a minor quirk, so we brushed it off. Upon our arrival in the late afternoon, the house appeared just as we had envisioned. Charming front porch, a warm interior, and plenty of natural light. The host left a note on the kitchen counter with instructions about trash pickup, the Wi-Fi password, and a gentle reminder not to mind the basement if we heard any odd noises. I'll admit that part made me a little uneasy, but Ben brushed it off, saying every older home has its quirks. For the first 3 nights, nothing happened. We heard some faint thumping right around bedtime, but it would stop after a while, so we ignored it. We didn't bother going down to the basement. We didn't even consider the basement, since there was no laundry to attend to, and the host hadn't prompted us to. Instead, we filled our days with hikes along local trails, and our evenings with cooking dinner and enjoying TV together. It felt wonderful to have the time to simply sit and converse without the pressure of needing to be somewhere else. Then, on the 4th night, as we prepared for bed, the thumping returned, this time louder and more rhythmic than before. Ben paused the show we were watching and shot me a questioning glance, as if to say, "This isn't just normal." "Pipes," he said. A chill ran through me, but I nodded in agreement. We made our way to the basement door and flicked on the light. The wooden stairs creaked beneath our feet as we descended. It was colder down there, and honestly, a bit eerie. Boxes and old furniture were stacked against the walls, and near the back of the basement stood a heavy metal door with a rusted padlock. The thumping sound was definitely coming from behind that door. We both just stood there, unsure of what to do. We tried calling the host, but it went unanswered. We went straight to voicemail, leaving a somewhat panicked message before heading back upstairs. Neither of us slept well that night, lying awake and conjuring all sorts of scenarios. By morning, we still hadn't heard from the host, so when he finally answered, we inquired about the locked metal door. He sounded almost irritated, insisting it was merely an old storage room that hadn't been touched in years and that we should leave it alone. Ben pressed a bit further, but the host dismissed our concerns, reiterating that it was just junk in there. That night, the thumping continued, came back at approximately 10 in the evening. This time I swear it sounded almost like someone knocking rather than pipes. Ben and I exchanged glances, and without a word, we both made our way to the basement. The thumping grew louder, as if whoever or whatever was behind that door was becoming more desperate. We knocked on the metal door, feeling somewhat foolish yet too unnerved to ignore it. Then we heard the faintest voice. It was unmistakably human and sounded weak, as if they were exhausted or injured. In that moment, everything shifted. An odd disruption turned into a real crisis. We dashed back upstairs to retrieve a heavy tire iron that Ben had stored in the car. Upon returning to the basement, the thumping had ceased, but we could still hear labored breathing emanating from behind the metal door. Ben instructed me to step back as he attempted to force the lock open, but it wouldn't yield. I grabbed a hammer from a nearby shelf, and together we struck the lock until it finally gave way. As soon as the door swung open, we were met with a wave of stale air and the sight of a middle-aged man, likely in his early 40s. He sat huddled on the floor, appearing dehydrated and terrified. We assisted him to his feet, and he struggled to articulate his thoughts. He revealed that he was related to the host, and something had gone terribly awry in their relationship, though he didn't delve into specifics. It seemed to be a bitter family dispute. He asserted that the host had effectively kidnapped him, confining him in the basement for an unknown duration. Without hesitation, we contacted the police, and a squad car arrived within 15 minutes to take our statements. After assisting the man out of the basement and into an ambulance, more police arrived, assuring us they would locate the host promptly. It became clear that we could no longer remain there. Ben and I hurriedly gathered our belongings, a wave of sickness washing over us as we realized we had spent days in that house while someone was confined below. The police reassured us we had acted correctly. A knot of guilt tightened in our stomachs. That night, we drove to a motel in a nearby town, the silence between us heavy and unbroken throughout the journey. I'm attempting to make sense of everything. We never learned the complete story regarding the host and that man, but we had enough information. The following day, we received a call from the police informing us that they had arrested the Airbnb host, while the man was released to his family. We expressed our gratitude and informed them that we would be returning home. That marked the conclusion of our brief vacation. This occurred back in 2005 when I was just 10 years old, living in a small town in Iowa where children roamed the streets without much concern. My home was not far from the local playground, perhaps 4 or 5 blocks away. My parents usually picked me up, but that evening they were both delayed at work. I made the decision to walk home alone. It was a late summer afternoon. The sun still shone brightly, yet the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. A slight twinge of nerves crept in, but I reassured myself that everything would be all right. As I strolled along the sidewalk, my backpack slung over one shoulder, I noticed the unusual quietness of the neighborhood. There wasn't a soul in sight, not even another kid riding a bike. Then, I heard something. Initially, the sound was too subtle to pinpoint, just a whisper of gravel crunching. I turned my head slightly and caught sight of a tall figure, dressed in dark pants, perhaps a jacket. The specifics elude me, but the moment is etched in my mind. He appeared to slow his stride as our eyes met, though his face remained obscured, sending a shiver down my spine. I quickly faced forward, quickening my steps in an attempt to appear nonchalant, my heart racing. I altered my path, hoping he would continue on or that I might encounter a neighbor who could offer some reassurance. Help! But every time I glanced back, he lingered at a distance. His posture felt too deliberate, as if he was trying to maintain a careful distance while keeping me in sight. I rounded the corner and spotted an old, run-down house that had been vacant for years. I had passed it plenty of times before. The windows were boarded up and the porch sagged badly. In that moment, hiding inside seemed like the safest bet. I figured he wouldn't follow me in there, so I slipped through a gap in the fence and crept behind the house. The interior was shrouded in darkness, a musty scent lingering in the air. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, leading into what once was a living room, now a chaotic scene of debris, broken drywall, scattered trash, and an old mattress. My hands shook as I leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of solitude in that dim space, praying the man wouldn't dare to enter. Then in a corner, partially obscured by a fallen section of ceiling, I spotted something, a figure that resembled an old man. His clothes were ragged and filthy, and he lay still. My mind raced, attempting to rationalize the sight. Perhaps he was merely asleep. But as I took a cautious step forward, uncertainty gripped me. As I drew nearer, it struck me that he wasn't breathing at all. His skin appeared pale and sunken, as if he had been there for an eternity. A wave of fear surged through me, so overwhelming that tears began to form in my eyes. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing in the hallway, slow and deliberate, each step crunching on the shattered plaster. My breath hitched in my throat as I recalled the man who had been trailing me. Was he inside now, too? I couldn't muster the courage to peek around the corner. All I yearned for was escape. So I bolted, sprinting through the debris, ducked through a shattered window, and stumbled into the backyard. My legs scraped on something, maybe a broken piece of wood, but I barely felt the pain. I ran onto the street, my heart pounding louder than I thought possible. When I looked over my shoulder, I didn't see the man anymore, just the empty yard, the boards, and the fence. I kept running and finally spotted a police car parked on the curb near a small convenience store. An officer was standing outside, chatting with the store owner. I rushed up to them, tears streaming down my face, babbling about a man was pursuing me alongside a lifeless body in that deserted house. The officer's demeanor shifted swiftly from irritation to worry as he opened the passenger door, urging me to get inside the car. I was trembling uncontrollably, struggling to find my voice. The officer attempted to soothe me, posing straightforward questions about my home and any injuries I might have. Meanwhile, he called for backup. Another officer soon arrived and made his way toward the dilapidated house. The officer driving me reassured me that I would be taken home to my parents. When we arrived at my house, my mom was already waiting on the porch. Pacing frantically, she must have just finished work and discovered my absence. The officer explained my words to her, then offered a reassuring pat on my shoulder, advising me to stay safe. Just like that, he departed to rejoin his partner at the old building. I never learned the complete story. I overheard my mom calling the police station later, but they remained tight-lipped, stating they had investigated the scene without confirming anything about the man who had been following me or the body. My dad attempted to comfort me, mentioning that sometimes homeless individuals seek shelter in desolate locations. The presence of the other man remained a mystery, leaving me puzzled about his intentions as he lingered behind me. To this day, the sight of a boarded-up house evokes memories of that lifeless old man, abandoned and solitary. I still ponder whether the figure who trailed me was connected to him or merely an unrelated passerby. This uncertainty has lingered in my mind for years, an unanswered question that continues to haunt me. I was just 13 during the summer of 2022 when my parents chose to treat us to a week-long cruise that set sail from Miami. Florida was meant to be an unforgettable adventure, my inaugural experience on a ship. The day before our departure, we stayed at a quaint hotel close to the port. I recall watching massive cruise liners glide by, a wave of excitement washing over me at the thought that one of them would be ours the following day. On embarkation day, everything felt like a whirlwind of lines, ID checks, and overly enthusiastic staff members. I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer size of the vessel. My dad, Bill, kept making jokes about needing a map just to locate our cabin, while my mom, Sarah, was captivated by the buffets, certain we'd indulge ourselves silly by the time we returned home. Looking back, I wish I'd remained by their side for the entire trip. Our first couple of days at sea were pretty much what I had envisioned. Swimming pools, massive dining rooms, and loud arcades. I spent most of my time exploring on my own, trying to memorize the decks and the shortcuts between them. On the second night, while I was heading back to our cabin, I noticed someone standing behind a row of deck chairs, a guy in a dark hoodie, just out of sight. The overhead lights cast a harsh glow, obscuring his features. I attempted to dismiss the feeling. After all, the ship was teeming with people, many cloaked in hoodies against the brisk sea breeze. Yet, an unsettling sensation lingered, as if unseen eyes were upon me. By the time I reached our cabin, I felt foolish for allowing a stranger to unsettle me. The following day, my parents and I embarked on a planned shore excursion upon disembarking in Nassau. I was eager to explore the lively markets and sample local delicacies while waiting in line for the tour. As I glanced back toward the pier, I spotted that same hooded figure leaning against a railing in the crowd. I couldn't see his face, but a gut feeling told me it was the same person from the deck chairs. My mind raced with questions. Why would he be following me? Was I imagining it? Throughout the excursion, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see that hoodie at every corner. We visited the Queen's Staircase, explored some historic forts, and ended with a quick lunch. I didn't notice him again, so I tried to shove the worries out of my head, but that evening, after dinner, I informed my mom of my plans to visit the arcade while she and my dad were off to a music show. I made my way through the corridors, which felt unusually deserted, likely because everyone was still dining or attending the performance. Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps trailing behind me. When I glanced back, there he was, just a few paces away, half of his face obscured by a hood. I froze, and for a brief moment we both stood still. Then, he turned down a side hallway and vanished. My stomach twisted as I hurried to the arcade, feeling the urgency to escape. They were pretending to engage in games I had no interest in until I believed I was safe. Once I returned to our cabin, I secured the door and attempted to bury the memory. The last night of the cruise arrived, and we were docked at Half Moon Cay, a private island. That evening, I stepped out to fetch a soda before bed, assuming the cafe would be empty. Walking alone along the open deck felt unsettling. The sea was dark, and the wind picked up, nearly drowning out the sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned around, he was standing right there, so close I almost, stumbling back. I couldn't see his entire face in the dim light, but I caught a glimpse of what seemed like a smirk. He leaned in, and before I could react, he said, "You're lucky I've changed my plan." My heart raced as I backed away, nearly tripping. By the time I regained my footing, he had stepped into the shadows. I considered yelling for help, but no sound escaped my lips. I just took off running, not stopping until I reached the bustling main deck. I never saw him again. When the ship docked in Miami the next morning, my parents and I left none the wiser. I felt too embarrassed to share all that transpired. I only hinted at feeling anxious at night, attributing it to seasickness or something along those lines.